Chapter 8. Inspector Raglan is confident. We looked at each other. "You'll have inquiries made at the station, of course?" I said. "Naturally, but I'm not over-sanguine as to the result. You know what that station is like." I did. King's Abbot is a mere village, but its station happens to be an important junction. Most of the big expresses stop there, and trains are shunted, resorted, and made up. It has 2 or 3 public telephone boxes. At that time of night, 3 local trains come in close upon each other to catch the connection with the express for the north, which comes in at 10:19 and leaves at 10:23. The whole place is in a bustle, and the chances of one particular person being noticed telephoning or getting into the express are very small indeed. "But why telephone at all?" demanded Melrose. "That is what I find so extraordinary. There seems no rhyme or reason in the thing." Poirot carefully straightened a china ornament on one of the bookcases. "Be sure there was a reason," he said over his shoulder. "But what reason could it be? When we know that, we shall know everything. This case is very curious and very interesting." There was something almost indescribable in the way he said those last words. I felt that he was looking at the case from some peculiar angle of his own, and what he saw I could not tell. He went to the window and stood there, looking out. "You say it was 9 o'clock, Dr. Shepherd, when you met this stranger outside the gate?" He asked the question without turning round. "Yes," I replied. "I heard the church clock chime the hour." "How long would it take him to reach the house, to reach this window, for instance?" 5 minutes at the outside. 2 or 3 minutes only if he took the path at the right of the drive and came straight here. But to do that, he would have to know the way. How can I explain myself? It would mean that he had been here before, that he knew his surroundings." "That is true," replied Colonel Melrose. "We could find out, doubtless, if Mr. Ackroyd had received any strangers during the past week." "Young Raymond could tell us that," I said. "Or Parker," suggested Colonel Melrose. "Oh, tous les deux," suggested Poirot, smiling. Colonel Melrose went in search of Raymond, and I rang the bell once more for Parker. Colonel Melrose returned almost immediately, accompanied by the young secretary, whom he introduced to Poirot. Geoffrey Raymond was fresh and debonair as ever. He seemed surprised and delighted to make Poirot's acquaintance. "No idea you'd been living among us incognito, M. Poirot," he said. "It will be a great privilege to watch you at work. Hullo, what's this?" Poirot had been standing just to the left of the door. Now he moved aside suddenly, and I saw that while my back was turned he must have swiftly drawn out the armchair till it stood in the position Parker had indicated. "Want me to sit in the chair whilst you take a blood test?" asked Raymond good-humoredly. "What's the idea?" "M. Raymond, this chair was pulled out so last night when Mr. Ackroyd was found killed. Someone moved it back again into place." "Did you do so?" The secretary's reply came without a second's hesitation. "No, indeed I didn't. I don't even remember that it was in that position, but it must have been if you say so. Anyway, somebody else must have moved it back to its proper place. Have they destroyed a clue in doing so?" "Too bad." "It is of no consequence," said the detective. "Of no consequence whatever. What I really want to ask you is this, M. Raymond, did any stranger come to see Mr. Ackroyd during this past week?" The secretary reflected for a minute or two, knitting his brows, and during the pause Parker appeared in answer to the bell. "No," said Raymond at last. "I can't remember anyone. Can you, Parker?" "I beg your pardon, sir?" "Any stranger coming to see Mr. Ackroyd this week?" The butler reflected for a minute or two. "There was the young man who came on Wednesday, sir," he said at last. "From Curtis and Trout, I understood he was." Raymond moved this aside with an impatient hand. "Oh, yes, I remember, but that is not the kind of stranger this gentleman means." He turned to Poirot. "Mr. Ackroyd had some idea of purchasing a dictaphone," he explained. It would have enabled us to get through a lot more work in a limited time. The firm in question sent down their representative, but nothing came of it. Mr. Ackroyd did not make up his mind to purchase. Poirot turned to the butler. "Can you describe this young man to me, my good Parker?" "He was fair-haired, sir, and short. Very neatly dressed in a blue serge suit. A very presentable young man, sir, for his station in life." Poirot turned to me. "The man you met outside the gate, doctor, was tall, was he not?" "Yes," I said. "Somewhere about 6 feet, I should say." "There is nothing in that, then," declared the Belgian. "I thank you, Parker." The butler spoke to Raymond. "Mr. Hammond has just arrived, sir," he said. "He is anxious to know if he can be of any service, and he would be glad to have a word with you." "I'll come at once," said the young man. He hurried out. Poirot looked inquiringly at the chief constable. "The family solicitor, M. Poirot," said the latter. "It is a busy time for this young M. Raymond," murmured M. Poirot. "He has the air efficient, that one. I believe Mr. Ackroyd considered him a most able secretary. He has been here, how long? Just on 2 years, I fancy. His duties he fulfills punctiliously. Of that I am sure. In what manner does he amuse himself? Does he go in for le sport?" "Private secretaries haven't much time for that sort of thing," said Colonel Melrose, smiling. "Raymond plays golf, I believe. And tennis in the summer time. He does not attend the courses, I should say the running of the horses." "Race meetings?" "No, I don't think he's interested in racing." Poirot nodded and seemed to lose interest. He glanced slowly round the study. "I have seen, I think, all that there is to be seen here." I too looked round. "If those walls could speak," I murmured. Poirot shook his head. "A tongue is not enough," he said. "They would have to have also eyes and ears. But do not be too sure that these dead things," he touched the top of the bookcase as he spoke, "are always dumb. To me they speak sometimes, chairs, tables, they have their message." He turned away towards the door. "What message?" I cried. "What have they said to you today?" He looked over his shoulder and raised one eyebrow quizzically. "An opened window," he said. "A locked door. A chair that apparently moved itself. To all three I say why, and I find no answer." He shook his head, puffed out his chest, and stood blinking at us. He looked ridiculously full of his own importance. It crossed my mind to wonder whether he was really any good as a detective. Had his big reputation been built up on a series of lucky chances? I think the same thought must have occurred to Colonel Melrose, for he frowned. "Anything more you want to see, M. Poirot?" he inquired brusquely. "You would perhaps be so kind as to show me the silver table from which the weapon was taken? After that, I will trespass on your kindness no longer." We went to the drawing-room, but on the way the constable waylaid the colonel, and after a muttered conversation, the latter excused himself and left us together. I showed Poirot the silver table, and after raising the lid once or twice and letting it fall, he pushed open the window and stepped out on the terrace. I followed him. Inspector Raglan had just turned the corner of the house and was coming towards us. His face looked grim and satisfied. "So there you are, M. Poirot," he said. "Well, this isn't going to be much of a case. I'm sorry too. A nice enough young fellow gone wrong." Poirot's face fell, and he spoke very mildly. "I'm afraid I shall not be able to be of much aid to you then." "Next time, perhaps," said the inspector soothingly. "Though we don't have murders every day in this quiet little corner of the world." Poirot's gaze took on an admiring quality. "You have been of a marvelous promptness," he observed. "How exactly did you go to work, if I may ask?" "Certainly," said the inspector. "To begin with, method. That's what I always say, method." "Ah," cried the other. "That too is my watchword. Method, order, and the little gray cells." "The cells," said the inspector, staring. "The little gray cells of the brain," explained the Belgian. Oh, of course, well, we all use them, I suppose. In a greater or lesser degree, murmured Poirot. And there are, too, differences in quality. Then there is the psychology of a crime. One must study that. Ah, said the inspector, you've been bitten with all this psychoanalysis stuff? Now I'm a plain man. Mrs. Raglan would not agree, I am sure, to that, said Poirot, making him a little bow. Inspector Raglan, a little taken aback, bowed. You don't understand, he said, grinning broadly. Lord, what a lot of difference language makes. I'm telling you how I set to work. First of all, method. Mr. Ackroyd was last seen alive at 9:45 by his niece, Miss Flora Ackroyd. That's fact number one, isn't it? If you say so. Well, it is. At 10:30, the doctor here says that Mr. Ackroyd has been dead at least half an hour. You stick to that, doctor? Certainly, I said. Half an hour or longer. Very good. That gives us exactly 1/4 of an hour in which the crime must have been committed. I make a list of everyone in the house and work through it, setting down opposite their names where they were and what they were doing between the hour of 9:45 and 10 p.m. He handed a sheet of paper to Poirot. I read it over his shoulder. It ran as follows, written in a neat script. Major Blunt, in billiard room with Mr. Raymond. Latter confirms. Mr. Raymond, billiard room. See above. Mrs. Ackroyd, 9:45 watching billiard match. Went up to bed 9:55. Raymond and Blunt watched her up staircase. Miss Ackroyd went straight from her uncle's room upstairs. Confirmed by Parker, also housemaid Elsie Dale. Servants. Parker went straight to butler's pantry. Confirmed by housekeeper Miss Russell, who came down to speak to him about something at 9:47 and remained at least 10 minutes. Miss Russell, as above. Spoke to housemaid Elsie Dale upstairs at 9:45. Ursula Bourne, parlourmaid, in her own room until 9:55. Then in servants' hall. Mrs. Cooper, cook, in servants' hall. Gladys Jones, second housemaid, in servants' hall. Elsie Dale, upstairs in bedroom. Seen there by Miss Russell and Miss Flora Ackroyd. Mary Thripp, kitchen maid, servants' hall. The cook has been here 7 years, the parlourmaid 18 months and Parker just over a year. The others are new. Except for something fishy about Parker, they all seem quite all right. A very complete list, said Poirot, handing it back to him. I am quite sure that Parker did not do the murder, he added gravely. So is my sister, I struck in. And she's usually right. Nobody paid any attention to my interpolation. That disposes pretty effectually of the household, continued the inspector. Now we come to a very grave point. The woman at the lodge, Mary Black, was pulling the curtains last night when she saw Ralph Patten turn in at the gate and go up towards the house. She is sure of that? I asked sharply. Quite sure. She knows him well by sight. He went past very quickly and turned off by the path to the right, which is a short cut to the terrace. And what time was that? Asked Poirot, who had sat with an immovable face. Exactly 25 minutes past 9, said the inspector gravely. There was a silence. Then the inspector spoke again. It's all clear enough. It fits in without a flaw. At 25 minutes past 9, Captain Patten is seen passing the lodge. At 9:30 or thereabouts, Mr. Geoffrey Raymond hears someone in here asking for money and Mr. Ackroyd refusing. What happens next? Captain Patten leaves the same way, through the window. He walks along the terrace, angry and baffled. He comes to the open drawing-room window. Say it's now 9:45. Miss Flora Ackroyd is saying good night to her uncle. Major Blunt, Mr. Raymond and Mrs. Ackroyd are in the billiard room. The drawing-room is empty. He steals in, takes the dagger from the silver table and returns to the study window. He slips off his shoes, climbs in and, well, I don't need to go into details. Then he slips out again and goes off. Hadn't the nerve to go back to the inn. He makes for the station, rings up from there. "Why?" said Poirot softly. I jumped at the interruption. The little man was leaning forward. His eyes shone with a queer green light. For a moment, Inspector Raglan was taken aback by the question. "It's difficult to say exactly why he did that," he said at last. "But murderers do funny things. You'd know that if you were in the police force. The cleverest of them make stupid mistakes sometimes. But come along and I'll show you those footprints." We followed him round the corner of the terrace to the study window. At a word from Raglan, a police constable produced the shoes which had been obtained from the local inn. The inspector laid them over the marks. "They're the same," he said confidently. "That is to say, they're not the same pair that actually made these prints. He went away in those. This is a pair just like them, but older. See how the studs are worn down." "Surely a great many people wear shoes with rubber studs in them?" asked Poirot. "That's so, of course," said the inspector. "I shouldn't put so much stress on the footmarks if it wasn't for everything else." "A very foolish young man, Captain Ralph Paddon," said Poirot thoughtfully, "to leave so much evidence of his presence." "Ah well," said the inspector, "it was a dry fine night, you know. He left no prints on the terrace or on the gravelled path. But unluckily for him, a spring must have welled up just lately at the end of the path from the drive. See here." A small gravelled path joined the terrace a few feet away. In one spot, a few yards from its termination, the ground was wet and boggy. Crossing this wet place there were again the marks of footsteps, and amongst them the shoes with rubber studs. Poirot followed the path on a little way, the inspector by his side. "You noticed the women's footprints?" he said suddenly. The inspector laughed. "Naturally. But several different women have walked this way, and men as well. It's a regular short cut to the house, you see. It would be impossible to sort out all the footsteps. After all, it's the ones on the window sill that are really important." Poirot nodded. "It's no good going farther," said the inspector as we came in view of the drive. "It's all gravelled again here, and hard as it can be." Again Poirot nodded, but his eyes were fixed on a small garden house, a kind of superior summer house. It was a little to the left of the path ahead of us, and a gravelled walk ran up to it. Poirot lingered about until the inspector had gone back towards the house. Then he looked at me. "You must have indeed been sent from the good God to replace my friend Hastings," he said with a twinkle. "I observe that you do not quit my side. How say you, Dr. Shepherd, shall we investigate that summer house? It interests me." He went up to the door and opened it. Inside, the place was almost dark. There were one or two rustic seats, a croquet set, and some folded deck chairs. I was startled to observe my new friend. He had dropped to his hands and knees and was crawling about the floor. Every now and then he shook his head as though not satisfied. Finally he sat back on his heels. "Nothing," he murmured. "Well, perhaps it was not to be expected. But it would have meant so much." He broke off, stiffening all over. Then he stretched out his hand to one of the rustic chairs. He detached something from one side of it. "What is it?" I cried. "What have you found?" He smiled, unclosing his hand so that I should see what lay in the palm of it. A scrap of stiff white cambric. I took it from him, looked at it curiously, and then handed it back. "What do you make of it, my friend?" he asked, eyeing me keenly. "A scrap torn from a handkerchief," I suggested, shrugging my shoulders. He made another dart and picked up a small quill, a goose quill by the look of it. "And that?" he cried triumphantly. "What do you make of that?" I only stared. He slipped the quill into his pocket and looked again at the scrap of white stuff. "A fragment of a handkerchief," he mused. "Perhaps you are right. But remember this, a good laundry does not starch a handkerchief." He nodded at me triumphantly, then he put away the scrap carefully in his pocketbook. Chapter 9. The Goldfish Pond. We walked back to the house together. There was no sign of the inspector. Poirot paused on the terrace and stood with his back to the house, slowly turning his head from side to side. "Une belle propriété," he said at last appreciatively. "Who inherits it?" His words gave me almost a shock. It is an odd thing, but until that moment, the question of inheritance had never come into my head. Poirot watched me keenly. "It is a new idea to you that," he said at last. "You had not thought of it before, eh?" "No," I said truthfully. "I wish I had." He looked at me again curiously. "I wonder just what you mean by that," he said thoughtfully. "Ah, no," as I was about to speak. "Inutile. You would not tell me your real thought." "Everyone has something to hide," I quoted, smiling. "Exactly. You still believe that?" "More than ever, my friend. But it is not easy to hide things from Hercule Poirot. He has a knack of finding out." He descended the steps of the Dutch garden as he spoke. "Let us walk a little," he said over his shoulder. "The air is pleasant today." I followed him. He led me down a path to the left enclosed in yew hedges. A walk led down the middle, bordered each side with formal flower beds, and at the end was a round paved recess with a seat and a pond of goldfish. Instead of pursuing the path to the end, Poirot took another which wound up the side of a wooded slope. In one spot the trees had been cleared away, and a seat had been put. Sitting there one had a splendid view over the countryside, and one looked right down on the paved recess and the goldfish pond. "England is very beautiful," said Poirot, his eyes straying over the prospect. Then he smiled. "And so are English girls," he said in a lower tone. "Hush, my friend, and look at the pretty picture below us." It was then that I saw Flora. She was moving along the path we had just left, and she was humming a little snatch of song. Her step was more dancing than walking, and in spite of her black dress there was nothing but joy in her whole attitude. She gave a sudden pirouette on her toes, and her black draperies swung out. At the same time she flung her head back and laughed outright. As she did so, a man stepped out from the trees. It was Hector Blunt. The girl started. Her expression changed a little. "How you startled me, I didn't see you." Blunt said nothing, but stood looking at her for a minute or two in silence. "What I like about you," said Flora with a touch of malice, "is your cheery conversation." I fancy that at that Blunt reddened under his tan. His voice, when he spoke, sounded different. It had a curious sort of humility in it. "Never was much of a fellow for talking. Not even when I was young." "That was a very long time ago, I suppose," said Flora gravely. I caught the undercurrent of laughter in her voice, but I don't think Blunt did. "Yes," he said simply, "it was." "How does it feel to be Methuselah?" asked Flora. This time the laughter was more apparent, but Blunt was following out an idea of his own. "Remember the Johnny who sold his soul to the devil in return for being made young again? There's an opera about it." "Faust, you mean?" "That's the beggar. Rum story. Some of us would do it if we could." "Anyone would think you were creaking at the joints to hear you talk," cried Flora, half vexed, half amused. Blunt said nothing for a minute or two. Then he looked away from Flora, into the middle distance, and observed to an adjacent tree trunk that it was about time he got back to Africa. "Are you going on another expedition, shooting things?" "Expect so. Usually do, you know, shoot things I mean." "You shot that head in the hall, didn't you?" Blunt nodded. Then he jerked out, going rather red as he did so. "Care for some decent skins any time? If so, I could get 'em for you." "Oh, please do," cried Flora. "Will you really? You won't forget?" "I shan't forget," said Hector Blunt. He added, in a sudden burst of communicativeness, "Time I went. I'm no good in this sort of life. Haven't got the manners for it. I'm a rough fellow, no use in society. Never remember the things one's expected to say. Yes, time I went." "But you're not going at once," cried Flora. Not not while we're in all this trouble. Oh. Please. If you go. She turned away a little. You want me to stay? Asked Blunt. He spoke deliberately, but quite simply. We all. I meant you personally, said Blunt with directness. Flora turned slowly back again and met his eyes. I want you to stay, she said, if that makes any difference. It makes all the difference, said Blunt. There was a moment's silence. They sat down on the stone seat by the goldfish pond. It seemed as though neither of them knew quite what to say next. It's such a lovely morning, said Flora at last. You know, I can't help feeling happy in spite of everything. That's awful, I suppose. Quite natural, said Blunt. Never saw your uncle until 2 years ago, did you? Can't be expected to grieve very much. Much better to have no humbug about it. There's something awfully consoling about you, said Flora. You make things so simple. Things are simple as a rule, said the big game hunter. Not always, said Flora. Her voice had lowered itself, and I saw Blunt turn and look at her, bringing his eyes back from, apparently, the coast of Africa to do so. He evidently put his own construction on her change of tone, for he said, after a minute or two, in rather an abrupt manner, I say, you know, you mustn't worry. About that young chap, I mean. Inspector's an ass. Everybody knows, utterly absurd to think he could have done it. Man from outside. Burglar chap. That's the only possible solution. Flora turned to look at him. You really think so? Don't you? Said Blunt quickly. Oh yes, of course. Another silence, and then Flora burst out. I'll tell you why I felt so happy this morning. However heartless you think me, I'd rather tell you. It's because the lawyer has been, Mr. Hammond. He told us about the will. Uncle Roger has left me £20,000. Think of it, 20,000 beautiful pounds. Blunt looked surprised. Does it mean so much to you? Mean much to me? Why, it's everything. Freedom, life, no more scheming and scraping and lying. Lying, said Blunt sharply interrupting. Flora seemed taken aback for a minute. You know what I mean, she said uncertainly. Pretending to be thankful for all the nasty cast-off things rich relations give you. Last year's coats and skirts and hats. Don't know much about ladies' clothes, should have said you were always very well turned out. It's cost me something though, said Flora in a low voice. Don't let's talk of horrid things. I'm so happy. I'm free. Free to do what I like. Free not to. She stopped suddenly. Not to what? Asked Blunt quickly. I forget now. Nothing important. Blunt had a stick in his hand, and he thrust it into the pond, poking at something. What are you doing, Major Blunt? There's something bright down there. Wondered what it was, looks like a gold brooch. Now I've stirred up the mud and it's gone. Perhaps it's a crown, suggested Flora. Like the one Melisande saw in the water. Melisande, said Blunt reflectively, she's in an opera, isn't she? Yes, you seem to know a lot about operas. People take me sometimes, said Blunt sadly. Funny idea of pleasure, worse racket than the natives make with their tom-toms. Flora laughed. I remember Melisande, continued Blunt, married an old chap old enough to be her father. He threw a small piece of flint into the goldfish pond. Then, with a change of manner, he turned to Flora. Miss Ackroyd, can I do anything? About Patton, I mean. I know how dreadfully anxious you must be. Thank you, said Flora in a cold voice. There is really nothing to be done. Ralph will be all right. I've got hold of the most wonderful detective in the world, and he's going to find out all about it. For some time I had felt uneasy as to our position. We were not exactly eavesdropping, since the two in the garden below had only to lift their heads to see us. Nevertheless, I should have drawn attention to our presence before now, had not my companion put a warning pressure on my arm. Clearly he wished me to remain silent. But now he rose briskly to his feet, clearing his throat. "I demand pardon," he cried. "I cannot allow Mademoiselle thus extravagantly to compliment me, and not draw attention to my presence. They say the listener hears no good of himself, but that is not the case this time. To spare my blushes, I must join you and apologize." He hurried down the path with me close behind him, and joined the others by the pond. "This is M. Hercule Poirot," said Flora. "I expect you've heard of him." Poirot bowed. "I know Major Blunt by reputation," he said politely. "I am glad to have encountered you, monsieur. I am in need of some information that you can give me." Blunt looked at him inquiringly. "When did you last see M. Ackroyd alive?" "At dinner." "And you neither saw nor heard anything of him after that?" "Didn't see him. Heard his voice." "How was that?" "I strolled out on the terrace." "Pardon me, what time was this?" "About 9:30. I was walking up and down smoking in front of the drawing-room window. I heard Ackroyd talking in his study." Poirot stooped and removed a microscopic weed. "Surely you couldn't hear voices in the study from that part of the terrace," he murmured. He was not looking at Blunt, but I was, and to my intense surprise I saw the latter flush. "Went as far as the corner," he explained unwillingly. "Ah, indeed," said Poirot. In the mildest manner, he conveyed an impression that more was wanted. "Thought I saw a woman disappearing into the bushes. Just a gleam of white, you know. Must have been mistaken. It was while I was standing at the corner of the terrace that I heard Ackroyd's voice speaking to that secretary of his." "Speaking to Mr. Geoffrey Raymond?" "Yes, that's what I supposed at the time. Seems I was wrong." "Mr. Ackroyd didn't address him by name?" "Oh no." "Then if I may ask, why did you think?" Blunt explained laboriously. "Took it for granted that it would be Raymond, because he had said just before I came out that he was taking some papers to Ackroyd. Never thought of it being anybody else." "Can you remember what the words you heard were?" "Afraid I can't. Something quite ordinary and unimportant. Only caught a scrap of it. I was thinking of something else at the time." "It is of no importance," murmured Poirot. "Did you move a chair back against the wall when you went into the study after the body was discovered?" "Chair? No, why should I?" Poirot shrugged his shoulders but did not answer. He turned to Flora. "There is one thing I should like to know from you, mademoiselle. When you were examining the things in the silver table with Dr. Shepherd, was the dagger in its place, or was it not?" Flora's chin shot up. "Inspector Raglan has been asking me that," she said resentfully. "I've told him, and I'll tell you. I'm perfectly certain the dagger was not there. He thinks it was and that Ralph sneaked it later in the evening. And he doesn't believe me. He thinks I'm saying it to shield Ralph." "And aren't you?" I asked gravely. Flora stamped her foot. "You too, Dr. Shepherd." "Oh, it's too bad." Poirot tactfully made a diversion. "It is true what I heard you say, Major Blunt. There is something that glitters in this pond. Let us see if I can reach it." He knelt down by the pond, baring his arm to the elbow, and lowered it in very slowly, so as not to disturb the bottom of the pond. But in spite of all his precautions, the mud eddied and swirled, and he was forced to draw his arm out again empty-handed. He gazed ruefully at the mud upon his arm. I offered him my handkerchief, which he accepted with fervent protestations of thanks. Blunt looked at his watch. "Nearly lunchtime," he said. "We'd better be getting back to the house." "You will lunch with us, M. Poirot?" asked Flora. "I should like you to meet my mother. She is very fond of Ralph." The little man bowed. "I shall be delighted, mademoiselle." "And you will stay too, won't you, Dr. Shepherd?" I hesitated. "Oh, do." I wanted to, so I accepted the invitation without further ceremony. We set out towards the house, Flora and Blunt walking ahead. What hair? Said Poirot to me in a low tone, nodding towards Flora. The real gold. They will make a pretty couple. She and the dark, handsome Captain Patten. Will they not? I looked at him inquiringly, but he began to fuss about a few microscopic drops of water on his coat sleeve. The man reminded me in some ways of a cat. His green eyes and his finicking habits. And all for nothing, too, I said sympathetically. I wonder what it was in the pond. Would you like to see? Asked Poirot. I stared at him. He nodded. My good friend, he said gently and reproachfully, Hercule Poirot does not run the risk of disarranging his costume without being sure of attaining his object. To do so would be ridiculous and absurd. I am never ridiculous. But you brought your hand out empty, I objected. There are times when it is necessary to have discretion. Do you tell your patients everything, doctor? I think not. Nor do you tell your excellent sister everything either, is it not so? Before showing my empty hand, I dropped what it contained into my other hand. You shall see what that was. He held out his left hand, palm open. On it lay a little circlet of gold. A woman's wedding ring. I took it from him. Look inside, commanded Poirot. I did so. Inside was an inscription in fine writing. From R. March 13th. I looked at Poirot, but he was busy inspecting his appearance in a tiny pocket glass. He paid particular attention to his mustaches, and none at all to me. I saw that he did not intend to be communicative. Chapter 10. The parlor maid. We found Mrs. Ackroyd in the hall. With her was a small, dried-up little man, with an aggressive chin and sharp gray eyes, and lawyer written all over him. Mr. Hammond is staying to lunch with us, said Mrs. Ackroyd. You know Major Blunt, Mr. Hammond? And dear Dr. Shepherd, also a close friend of poor Roger's. And let me see. She paused, surveying Hercule Poirot in some perplexity. This is M. Poirot, mother, said Flora. I told you about him this morning. Oh. Yes, said Mrs. Ackroyd vaguely. Of course, my dear, of course. He is to find Ralph, is he not? He is to find out who killed Uncle, said Flora. Oh. My dear, cried her mother. Please. My poor nerves. I am a wreck this morning, a positive wreck. Such a dreadful thing to happen. I can't help feeling that it must have been an accident of some kind. Roger was so fond of handling queer curios. His hand must have slipped or something. This theory was received in polite silence. I saw Poirot edge up to the lawyer and speak to him in a confidential undertone. They moved aside into the embrasure of the window. I joined them, then hesitated. Perhaps I'm intruding, I said. Not at all, cried Poirot heartily. You and I am the doctor. We investigate this affair side by side. Without you I should be lost. I desire a little information from the good Mr. Hammond. You are acting on behalf of Captain Ralph Patten, I understand, said the lawyer cautiously. Poirot shook his head. Not so. I am acting in the interests of justice. Miss Ackroyd has asked me to investigate the death of her uncle. Mr. Hammond seemed slightly taken aback. I cannot seriously believe that Captain Patten can be concerned in this crime, he said, however strong the circumstantial evidence against him may be. The mere fact that he was hard-pressed for money. Was he hard-pressed for money? Interpolated Poirot quickly. The lawyer shrugged his shoulders. It was a chronic condition with Ralph Patten, he said dryly. Money went through his hands like water. He was always applying to his stepfather. Had he done so of late? During the last year, for instance? I cannot say. Mr. Ackroyd did not mention the fact to me. I comprehend. Mr. Hammond, I take it that you are acquainted with the provisions of Mr. Ackroyd's will. Certainly. That is my principal business here today. Then, seeing that I am acting for Miss Ackroyd, You will not object to telling me the terms of that will? They are quite simple. Shorn of legal phraseology, and after paying certain legacies and bequests. Such as? Interrupted Poirot. Mr. Hammond seemed a little surprised. £1,000 to his housekeeper, Miss Russell, £50 to the cook, Emma Cooper, £500 to his secretary, Mr. Geoffrey Raymond. Then to various hospitals. Poirot held up his hand. Ah, the charitable bequests, they interest me not. Quite so. The income on £10,000 worth of shares to be paid to Mrs. Cecil Ackroyd during her lifetime. Miss Flora Ackroyd inherits £20,000 outright. The residue, including this property and the shares in Ackroyd & Son, to his adopted son Ralph Patten. Mr. Ackroyd possessed a large fortune? A very large fortune. Captain Patten will be an exceedingly wealthy young man. There was a silence. Poirot and the lawyer looked at each other. Mr. Hammond, came Mrs. Ackroyd's voice plaintively from the fireplace. The lawyer answered the summons. Poirot took my arm and drew me right into the window. Regard the irises, he remarked in rather a loud voice. Magnificent, are they not? A straight and pleasing effect. At the same time I felt the pressure of his hand on my arm, and he added in a low tone, Do you really wish to aid me? To take part in this investigation? Yes, indeed, I said eagerly. There's nothing I should like better. You don't know what a dull old fogey's life I lead. Never anything out of the ordinary. Good, we will be colleagues then. In a minute or two I fancy Major Blunt will join us. He is not happy with the good mamma. Now there are some things I want to know, but I do not wish to seem to want to know them. You comprehend? So it will be your part to ask the questions. What questions do you want me to ask? I asked apprehensively. I want you to introduce the name of Mrs. Ferrars. Yes? Speak of her in a natural fashion. Ask him if he was down here when her husband died. You understand the kind of thing I mean. And while he replies, watch his face without seeming to watch it. C'est compris. There was no time for more, for at that minute, as Poirot had prophesied, Blunt left the others in his abrupt fashion and came over to us. I suggested strolling on the terrace, and he acquiesced. Poirot stayed behind. I stopped to examine a late rose. How things change in the course of a day or so, I observed. I was up here last Wednesday, I remember, walking up and down this same terrace. Ackroyd was with me, full of spirits. And now, 3 days later, Ackroyd's dead, poor fellow. Mrs. Ferrars is dead. You knew her, didn't you? But of course you did. Blunt nodded his head. Had you seen her since you'd been down this time? Went with Ackroyd to call. Last Tuesday, think it was. Fascinating woman, but something queer about her. Deep, one would never know what she was up to. I looked into his steady gray eyes. Nothing there, surely. I went on. I suppose you'd met her before. Last time I was here, she and her husband had just come here to live. He paused a minute and then added, rum thing, she had changed a lot between then and now. How changed? I asked. Looked 10 years older. Were you down here when her husband died? I asked, trying to make the question sound as casual as possible. No. From all I heard, it would be a good riddance. Uncharitable perhaps, but the truth. I agreed. Ashley Ferrars was by no means a pattern husband, I said cautiously. Blackguard, I thought, said Blunt. No, I said, only a man with more money than was good for him. Oh, money. All the troubles in the world can be put down to money, or the lack of it. Which has been your particular trouble? I asked. I've enough for what I want. I'm one of the lucky ones. Indeed. I'm not too flush just now, as a matter of fact. Came into a legacy a year ago, and like a fool let myself be persuaded into putting it into some wildcat scheme. I sympathized, and narrated my own similar trouble. Then the gong pealed out and we all went in to lunch. Poirot drew me back a little. "Eh bien?" "He's all right," I said. "I'm sure of it. Nothing disturbing." "He had a legacy just a year ago," I said. "But why not? Why shouldn't he? I'll swear the man is perfectly square and above board." Without doubt," said Poirot soothingly. "Do not upset yourself." He spoke as though to a fractious child. We all trooped into the dining room. It seemed incredible that less than 24 hours had passed since I last sat at that table. Afterwards, Mrs. Ackroyd took me aside and sat down with me on a sofa. "I can't help feeling a little hurt," she murmured, producing a handkerchief of the kind obviously not meant to be cried into. "Hurt, I mean, by Roger's lack of confidence in me. That £20,000 ought to have been left to me, not to Flora. A mother could be trusted to safeguard the interests of her child. A lack of trust, I call it." "You forget, Mrs. Ackroyd," I said. "Flora was Ackroyd's own niece, a blood relation. It would have been different had you been his sister instead of his sister-in-law. As poor Cecil's widow, I think my feelings ought to have been considered," said the lady, touching her eyelashes gingerly with the handkerchief. "But Roger was always most peculiar, not to say mean, about money matters. It has been a most difficult position for both Flora and myself. He did not even give the poor child an allowance. He would pay her bills, you know, and even that with a good deal of reluctance and asking what she wanted all those fal-lals for, so like a man, but now I've forgotten what it was I was going to say. Oh yes, not a penny we could call our own, you know. Flora resented it. Yes, I must say she resented it very strongly. Though devoted to her uncle, of course. But any girl would have resented it. Yes, I must say Roger had very strange ideas about money. He wouldn't even buy new face towels, though I told him the old ones were in holes. And then, proceeded Mrs. Ackroyd, with a sudden leap highly characteristic of her conversation, to leave all that money, £1,000, fancy £1,000 to that woman. What woman? That Russell woman. Something very queer about her, and so I've always said. But Roger wouldn't hear a word against her. Said she was a woman of great force of character, and that he admired and respected her. He was always going on about her rectitude and independence and moral worth. I think there's something fishy about her. She was certainly doing her best to marry Roger. But I soon put a stop to that. She's always hated me. Naturally. I saw through her. I began to wonder if there was any chance of stemming Mrs. Ackroyd's eloquence and getting away. Mr. Hammond provided the necessary diversion by coming up to say goodbye. I seized my chance and rose also. "About the inquest," I said. "Where would you prefer it to be held? Here or at the Three Boars?" Mrs. Ackroyd stared at me with a dropped jaw. "The inquest?" she asked, a picture of consternation. "But surely there won't have to be an inquest." Mr. Hammond gave a dry little cough and murmured, "Inevitable. Under the circumstances," in two short little barks. "But surely Dr. Shepherd can arrange?" "There are limits to my powers of arrangement," I said dryly. "If his death was an accident—" "He was murdered, Mrs. Ackroyd," I said brutally. She gave a little cry. No theory of accident will hold water for a minute. Mrs. Ackroyd looked at me in distress. I had no patience with what I thought was her silly fear of unpleasantness. "If there's an inquest, I shan't have to answer questions and all that, shall I?" she asked. "I don't know what will be necessary," I answered. "I imagine Mr. Raymond will take the brunt of it off you. He knows all the circumstances and can give formal evidence of identification." The lawyer assented with a little bow. "I really don't think there is anything to dread, Mrs. Ackroyd," he said. "You will be spared all unpleasantness. Now as to the question of money, have you all you need for the present? I mean," he added, as she looked at him inquiringly, "ready money. Cash, you know. If not, I can arrange to let you have whatever you require." "That ought to be all right," said Raymond, who was standing by. "Mr. Ackroyd cashed a check for £100 yesterday." £100? "Yes. For wages and other expenses due today. At the moment it is still intact." "Where is this money?" "In his desk." "No, he always kept his cash in his bedroom. In an old collar box, to be accurate." "Funny idea, wasn't it?" "I think," said the lawyer, "we ought to make sure the money is there before I leave." "Certainly," agreed the secretary. "I'll take you up now." "Oh, I forgot. The door's locked." Inquiry from Parker elicited the information that Inspector Raglan was in the housekeeper's room asking a few supplementary questions. A few minutes later, the inspector joined the party in the hall, bringing the key with him. He unlocked the door, and we passed into the lobby and up the small staircase. At the top of the stairs, the door into Ackroyd's bedroom stood open. Inside the room it was dark, the curtains were drawn and the bed was turned down just as it had been last night. The inspector drew the curtains, letting in the sunlight, and Geoffrey Raymond went to the top drawer of a rosewood bureau. He kept his money like that, in an unlocked drawer. "Just fancy," commented the inspector. The secretary flushed a little. Mr. Ackroyd had perfect faith in the honesty of all the servants, he said hotly. "Oh, quite so," said the inspector hastily. Raymond opened the drawer, took out a round leather collar box from the back of it, and opening it drew out a thick wallet. "Here is the money," he said, taking out a fat roll of notes. "You will find the 100 intact, I know, for Mr. Ackroyd put it in the collar box in my presence last night when he was dressing for dinner, and of course it has not been touched since." Mr. Hammond took the roll from him and counted it. He looked up sharply. £100, you said? But there is only 60 here." Raymond stared at him. "Impossible," he cried, springing forward. Taking the notes from the other's hand, he counted them aloud. Mr. Hammond had been right. The total amounted to £60. "But I can't understand it," cried the secretary, bewildered. Poirot asked a question. "You saw Mr. Ackroyd put this money away last night when he was dressing for dinner? You are sure he had not paid away any of it already?" "I'm sure he hadn't. He even said, 'I don't want to take £100 down to dinner with me. Too bulgy.'" "Then the affair is very simple," remarked Poirot. "Either he paid out that £40 sometime last evening, or else it has been stolen." "That's the matter in a nutshell," agreed the inspector. He turned to Mrs. Ackroyd. "Which of the servants would come in here yesterday evening?" "I suppose the housemaid would turn down the bed." "Who is she? What do you know about her?" "She's not been here very long," said Mrs. Ackroyd. "But she's a nice, ordinary country girl." "I think we ought to clear this matter up," said the inspector. "If Mr. Ackroyd paid that money away himself, it may have a bearing on the mystery of the crime. The other servants all right, as far as you know?" "Oh, I think so." "Not missed anything before?" "No." "None of them leaving, or anything like that?" "The parlor maid is leaving." "When?" "She gave notice yesterday, I believe." "To you?" "Oh no. I have nothing to do with the servants. Miss Russell attends to the household matters." The inspector remained lost in thought for a minute or two. Then he nodded his head and remarked, "I think I'd better have a word with Miss Russell, and I'll see the girl Dale as well." Poirot and I accompanied him to the housekeeper's room. Miss Russell received us with her usual sang-froid. Elsie Dale had been at Fernley 5 months. A nice girl, quick at her duties and most respectable. Good references. The last girl in the world to take anything not belonging to her. What about the parlor maid? She too was a most superior girl. Very quiet and ladylike. An excellent worker. "Then why is she leaving?" asked the inspector. Miss Russell pursed up her lips. It was none of my doing. I understand Mr. Ackroyd found fault with her yesterday afternoon. It was her duty to do the study, and she disarranged some of the papers on his desk, I believe. He was very annoyed about it, and she gave notice. At least that is what I understood from her, but perhaps you'd like to see her yourselves." The inspector assented. I had already noticed the girl when she was waiting on us at lunch. A tall girl, with a lot of brown hair rolled tightly away at the back of her neck and very steady gray eyes. She came in answer to the housekeeper's summons and stood very straight with those same gray eyes fixed on us. "You are Ursula Bourne?" asked the inspector. "Yes, sir." "I understand you are leaving." "Yes, sir." "Why is that?" "I disarranged some papers on Mr. Ackroyd's desk. He was very angry about it, and I said I had better leave. He told me to go as soon as possible." "Were you in Mr. Ackroyd's bedroom at all last night? Tidying up or anything?" "No, sir. That is Elsie's work. I never went near that part of the house. I must tell you, my girl, that a large sum of money is missing from Mr. Ackroyd's room." At last I saw her roused. A wave of color swept over her face. "I know nothing about any money. If you think I took it, and that is why Mr. Ackroyd dismissed me, you are wrong." "I'm not accusing you of taking it, my girl," said the inspector. "Don't flare up so." The girl looked at him coldly. "You can search my things if you like," she said disdainfully. "But you won't find anything." Poirot suddenly interposed. "It was yesterday afternoon that Mr. Ackroyd dismissed you, or you dismissed yourself, was it not?" he asked. The girl nodded. "How long did the interview last?" "The interview?" "Yes, the interview between you and Mr. Ackroyd in the study?" I don't know. 20 minutes? Half an hour? Something like that. Not longer. Not longer than half an hour, certainly. Thank you, mademoiselle." I looked curiously at him. He was rearranging a few objects on the table, setting them straight with precise fingers. His eyes were shining. "That'll do," said the inspector. Ursula Bourne disappeared. The inspector turned to Miss Russell. "How long has she been here? Have you got a copy of the reference you had with her?" Without answering the first question, Miss Russell moved to an adjacent bureau, opened one of the drawers, and took out a handful of letters clipped together with a patent fastener. She selected one and handed it to the inspector. "H.M.," said he. "Reads all right. Mrs. Richard Folliot, Marby Grange, Marby. Who's this woman?" "Quite good county people," said Miss Russell. "Well," said the inspector, handing it back, "let's have a look at the other one, Elsie Dale." Elsie Dale was a big fair girl, with a pleasant but slightly stupid face. She answered our questions readily enough, and showed much distress and concern at the loss of the money. "I don't think there's anything wrong with her," observed the inspector after he had dismissed her. "What about Parker?" Miss Russell pursed her lips together and made no reply. "I've a feeling there's something wrong about that man," the inspector continued thoughtfully. "The trouble is that I don't quite see when he got his opportunity. He'd be busy with his duties immediately after dinner, and he's got a pretty good alibi all through the evening. I know, for I've been devoting particular attention to it." "Well, thank you very much, Miss Russell. We'll leave things as they are for the present. It's highly probable Mr. Ackroyd paid that money away himself." The housekeeper bade us a dry good afternoon, and we took our leave. I left the house with Poirot. "I wonder," I said, breaking the silence, "what the papers the girl disarranged could have been for Ackroyd to have got into such a state about them. I wonder if there is any clue there to the mystery." "The secretary said there were no papers of particular importance on the desk," said Poirot quietly. "Yes, but," I paused. "It strikes you as odd that Ackroyd should have flown into a rage about so trivial a matter?" "Yes, it does rather." "But was it a trivial matter?" Of course, I admitted, we don't know what those papers may have been. But Raymond certainly said. Leave M. Raymond out of it for a minute. What did you think of that girl? Which girl? The parlor maid. Yes, the parlor maid. Ursula Bourne. She seemed a nice girl, I said hesitatingly. Poirot repeated my words, but whereas I had laid a slight stress on the fourth word, he put it on the second. She seemed a nice girl, yes. Then, after a minute's silence, he took something from his pocket and handed it to me. See, my friend, I will show you something. Look there. The paper he had handed me was that compiled by the inspector and given by him to Poirot that morning. Following the pointing finger, I saw a small cross marked in pencil opposite the name Ursula Bourne. You may not have noticed it at the time, my good friend, but there was one person on this list whose alibi had no kind of confirmation. Ursula Bourne. You don't think? Dr. Shepherd, I dare to think anything. Ursula Bourne may have killed Mr. Ackroyd, but I confess I can see no motive for her doing so. Can you? He looked at me very hard, so hard that I felt uncomfortable. Can you? He repeated. No motive whatsoever, I said firmly. His gaze relaxed. He frowned and murmured to himself. Since the blackmailer was a man, it follows that she cannot be the blackmailer, then. I coughed. As far as that goes, I began doubtfully. He spun round on me. What? What are you going to say? Nothing. Nothing. Only that, strictly speaking, Mrs. Ferrars in her letter mentioned a person. She didn't actually specify a man. But we took it for granted, Ackroyd and I, that it was a man. Poirot did not seem to be listening to me. He was muttering to himself again. But then it is possible after all. Yes, certainly it is possible, but then, I must rearrange my ideas. Method, order, never have I needed them more. Everything must fit in its appointed place, otherwise I am on the wrong tack. He broke off and whirled round upon me again. Where is Marby? It's on the other side of Cranchester. How far away? Oh, 14 miles perhaps. Would it be possible for you to go there? Tomorrow, say. Tomorrow? Let me see, that's Sunday. Yes, I could arrange it. What do you want me to do there? See this Mrs. Folliot. Find out all you can about Ursula Bourne. Very well. But I don't much care for the job. It is not the time to make difficulties. A man's life may hang on this. Poor Ralph, I said with a sigh. You believe him to be innocent, though? Poirot looked at me very gravely. Do you want to know the truth? Of course. Then you shall have it. My friend, everything points to the assumption that he is guilty. What? I exclaimed. Poirot nodded. Yes, that stupid inspector, for he is stupid, has everything pointing his way. I seek for the truth, and the truth leads me every time to Ralph Patten. Motive, opportunity, means. But I will leave no stone unturned. I promised Mademoiselle Flora. And she was very sure, that little one. But very sure indeed. Chapter 11. Poirot pays a call. I was slightly nervous when I rang the bell at Marby Grange the following afternoon. I wondered very much what Poirot expected to find out. He had entrusted the job to me. Why? Was it because, as in the case of questioning Major Blunt, he wished to remain in the background? The wish, intelligible in the first case, seemed to me quite meaningless here. My meditations were interrupted by the advent of a smart parlour-maid. Yes, Mrs. Folliot was at home. I was ushered into a big drawing-room and looked round me curiously as I waited for the mistress of the house. A large bare room, some good bits of old china, and some beautiful etchings, shabby covers and curtains. A lady's room in every sense of the term. I turned from the inspection of a Bartolozzi on the wall as Mrs. Folliot came into the room. She was a tall woman, with untidy brown hair and a very winning smile. "Dr. Shepherd," she said hesitatingly. "That is my name," I replied. "I must apologize for calling upon you like this, but I wanted some information about a parlourmaid previously employed by you, Ursula Bourne." With the utterance of the name, the smile vanished from her face, and all the cordiality froze out of her manner. She looked uncomfortable and ill at ease. "Ursula Bourne?" she said hesitatingly. "Yes," I said. "Perhaps you don't remember the name." "Oh yes, of course. I remember perfectly." "She left you just over a year ago, I understand?" "Yes. Yes, she did. That is quite right." "And you were satisfied with her whilst she was with you? How long was she with you, by the way?" "Oh, a year or two. I can't remember exactly how long. She is very capable. I'm sure you will find her quite satisfactory." I didn't know she was leaving Fernley. I hadn't the least idea of it. "Can you tell me anything about her?" I asked. "Anything about her?" "Yes, where she comes from, who her people are, that sort of thing." Mrs. Folliot's face wore more than ever its frozen look. "I don't know at all." "Who was she with before she came to you?" "I'm afraid I don't remember." There was a spark of anger now underlying her nervousness. She flung up her head in a gesture that was vaguely familiar. "Is it really necessary to ask all these questions?" "Not at all," I said, with an air of surprise and a tinge of apology in my manner. "I had no idea you would mind answering them. I am very sorry." Her anger left her, and she became confused again. "Oh, I don't mind answering them. I assure you I don't. Why should I? It just seemed a little odd, you know. That's all. A little odd." One advantage of being a medical practitioner is that you can usually tell when people are lying to you. I should have known from Mrs. Folliot's manner, if from nothing else, that she did mind answering my questions, minded intensely. She was thoroughly uncomfortable and upset, and there was plainly some mystery in the background. I judged her to be a woman quite unused to deception of any kind, and consequently rendered acutely uneasy when forced to practice it. A child could have seen through her. But it was also clear that she had no intention of telling me anything further. Whatever the mystery centering around Ursula Bourne might be, I was not going to learn it through Mrs. Folliot. Defeated, I apologized once more for disturbing her, took my hat and departed. I went to see a couple of patients, and arrived home about 6 o'clock. Caroline was sitting beside the wreck of tea things. She had that look of suppressed exultation on her face, which I know only too well. It is a sure sign with her, of either the getting or the giving of information. I wondered which it had been. "I've had a very interesting afternoon," began Caroline, as I dropped into my own particular easy chair and stretched out my feet to the inviting blaze in the fireplace. "Have you?" I asked. "Miss Gannett drop in to tea?" Miss Gannett is one of the chief of our newsmongers. "Guess again," said Caroline with intense complacency. I guessed several times, working slowly through all the members of Caroline's intelligence corps. My sister received each guess with a triumphant shake of the head. In the end, she volunteered the information herself. "And Poirot," she said. "Now what do you think of that?" I thought a good many things of it, but I was careful not to say them to Caroline. "Why did he come?" I asked. "To see me, of course. He said that knowing my brother so well, he hoped he might be permitted to make the acquaintance of his charming sister. Your charming sister I've got mixed up, but you know what I mean." "What did he talk about?" I asked. "He told me a lot about himself and his cases. You know that Prince Paul of Mauritania, the one who's just married a dancer?" "Yes. I saw a most intriguing paragraph about her in Society Snippets the other day. hinting that she was really a Russian Grand Duchess, one of the Tsar's daughters who managed to escape from the Bolsheviks. Well, it seems that M. Poirot solved a baffling murder mystery that threatened to involve them both. Prince Paul was beside himself with gratitude. Did he give him an emerald tie pin the size of a plover's egg? I inquired sarcastically. He didn't mention it. Why? Nothing, I said. I thought it was always done. It is in detective fiction anyway. The super detective always has his rooms littered with rubies and pearls and emeralds from grateful royal clients. It's very interesting to hear about these things from the inside, said my sister complacently. It would be, to Caroline. I could not but admire the ingenuity of M. Hercule Poirot, who had selected unerringly the case of all others that would most appeal to an elderly maiden lady living in a small village. Did he tell you if the dancer was really a Grand Duchess? I inquired. He was not at liberty to speak, said Caroline importantly. I wondered how far Poirot had strained the truth in talking to Caroline, probably not at all. He had conveyed his innuendos by means of his eyebrows and his shoulders. And after all this, I remarked, I suppose you were ready to eat out of his hand. Don't be coarse, James. I don't know where you get these vulgar expressions from. Probably from my only link with the outside world, my patients. Unfortunately, my practice does not lie amongst royal princes and interesting Russian émigrés. Caroline pushed her spectacles up and looked at me. You seem very grumpy, James. It must be your liver. A blue pill, I think, tonight. To see me in my own home, you would never imagine that I was a doctor of medicine. Caroline does the home prescribing both for herself and me. Damn my liver, I said irritably. Did you talk about the murder at all? Well, naturally, James. What else is there to talk about locally? I was able to set M. Poirot right upon several points. He was very grateful to me. He said I had the makings of a born detective in me, and a wonderful psychological insight into human nature. Caroline was exactly like a cat that is full to overflowing with rich cream. She was positively purring. He talked a lot about the little gray cells of the brain and of their functions. His own, he says, are of the first quality. He would say so, I remarked bitterly. Modesty is certainly not his middle name. I wish you would not be so horribly American, James. He thought it very important that Ralph should be found as soon as possible, and induced to come forward and give an account of himself. He says that his disappearance will produce a very unfortunate impression at the inquest. And what did you say to that? I agreed with him, said Caroline importantly. And I was able to tell him the way people were already talking about it. Caroline, I said sharply, did you tell M. Poirot what you overheard in the wood that day? I did, said Caroline complacently. I got up and began to walk about. You realize what you're doing, I hope, I jerked out. You're putting a halter round Ralph Patton's neck as surely as you're sitting in that chair. Not at all, said Caroline, quite unruffled. I was surprised you hadn't told him. I took very good care not to, I said. I'm fond of that boy. So am I. That's why I say you're talking nonsense. I don't believe Ralph did it, and so the truth can't hurt him, and we ought to give M. Poirot all the help we can. Why, I think, very likely Ralph was out with that identical girl on the night of the murder, and if so, he's got a perfect alibi. If he's got a perfect alibi, I retorted, why doesn't he come forward and say so? Might get the girl into trouble, said Caroline sapiently. But if M. Poirot gets hold of her and puts it to her as her duty, she'll come forward of her own accord and clear Ralph. You seem to have invented a romantic fairy story of your own, I said. You read too many trashy novels, Caroline. I've always told you so. I dropped into my chair again. Did Poirot ask you any more questions? I inquired. Only about the patients you had that morning. The patients? I demanded, unbelievingly. Yes, your surgery patients. How many and who they were? Do you mean to say you were able to tell him that? I demanded. Caroline is really amazing. Why not? Asked my sister triumphantly. I can see the path up to the surgery door perfectly from this window. And I've got an excellent memory, James. Much better than yours, let me tell you. I'm sure you have, I murmured mechanically. My sister went on, checking the names on her fingers. There was old Mrs. Bennet, and that boy from the farm with the bad finger, Dolly Grice to have a needle out of her finger, that American steward off the liner. Let me see, that's 4. Yes, and old George Evans with his ulcer. And lastly, she paused significantly. Well? Caroline brought out her climax triumphantly. She hissed in the most approved style, aided by the fortunate number of S's at her disposal. Miss Russell. She sat back in her chair and looked at me meaningly, and when Caroline looks at you meaningly, it is impossible to miss it. I don't know what you mean, I said quite untruthfully. Why shouldn't Miss Russell consult me about her bad knee? Bad knee, said Caroline. Fiddlesticks. No more bad knee than you and I. She was after something else. What? I asked. Caroline had to admit that she didn't know. But depend upon it, that was what he was trying to get at, M. Poirot, I mean. There's something fishy about that woman, and he knows it. Precisely the remark Mrs. Ackroyd made to me yesterday, I said. That there was something fishy about Miss Russell. Ah, said Caroline darkly, Mrs. Ackroyd. There's another. Another what? Caroline refused to explain her remarks. She merely nodded her head several times, rolled up her knitting, and went upstairs to don the high mauve silk blouse and the gold locket which she calls dressing for dinner. I stayed there staring into the fire and thinking over Caroline's words. Had Poirot really come to gain information about Miss Russell, or was it only Caroline's tortuous mind that interpreted everything according to her own ideas? There had certainly been nothing in Miss Russell's manner that morning to arouse suspicion. At least, I remembered her persistent conversation on the subject of drug-taking, and from that, she had led the conversation to poisons and poisoning. But there was nothing in that. Ackroyd had not been poisoned. Still, it was odd. I heard Caroline's voice, rather acid in note, calling from the top of the stairs. James, you will be late for dinner. I put some coal on the fire and went upstairs obediently. It is well at any price to have peace in the home.